This video is almost certainly going to be demonetized, so I guess I'll just say off the bat a thing I normally just slip in at the end of the videos. I have a Patreon, it will be linked in the description. Check it out if you want to support my dream of discussing the omegaverse for a living. Thank you. Also, thank you to Dipsy for sponsoring this video. I'll be talking a little bit about them later on. So I'm conscious that some of you will have clicked on this video fully aware of what I'm about to talk about, and some of you will be like, oh, I have no idea what that is, but I love to learn about new things. I'll give it a watch. And so I've been racking my brain as to how to introduce this in a way that doesn't sound totally unhinged, especially for those of you who have no clue what you're about to get yourself into. Let's start with the most basic of introductions. Omegaverse, also known as ABO, is a genre commonly associated with fan fiction or romance and erotica writing. It's existed in its current form for around a decade. It's gained notoriety more recently for a number of reasons, including a highly public court case and the fact that it is essentially writing about an alternate version of our society where everyone has a secondary gender or sex outside of just male and female that involves some interesting changes to their physical anatomy, shall we say, that we will dive into a bit later in more detail. I come to this topic from an interesting place, I think. I've thought for a while now that there seems to be a disconnect between people who read and enjoy fan fiction and those that don't. If you haven't read it, then there's this overwhelming stereotype that it's all badly written erotica. And so if you were to assume why someone might read fan fiction, it would be simply to get off, I guess. Like, it's a thing that people say if there's something that's badly written, oh, it sounded like fan fiction, like that read like fan fiction, as if universally it's just gonna be bad. And that must be especially true of people reading omegaverse fic, right? Some strange subsection of people who want to read about weird sex organs and funny new genders. But I am asexual, the type of asexual where erotica and sex scenes aren't really very interesting to me. And yeah, I've read omegaverse fanfiction and enjoyed it. And I think that puts me in a kind of interesting position in this discussion, straddling the line between outside observer and knowledgeable insider. It's pretty easy to talk about omegaverse fiction by finding the worst of the worst in terms of writing and technique and making a video talking about how it's a weird, scary corner of the internet. But in this video, we're going to be looking beyond that. I won't be reading sections of fanfiction to like sensationalize it in this video, but there are a few fanfics that have been quoted in previous academic articles and like studies with the writer's permission that I will be quoting from for some context. In this video, we're going to talk about the possibilities and potential of the omegaverse, not how it's written and used by like every single author, because like any genre of fiction, especially genres of fan fiction which exist without any quality control online, there will be different uses of the conventions, themes and ideas, and different levels of quality. The more I thought about it and researched, the more I began to realize that why people are interested in this trope actually says a whole lot about our own ideas of gender and sexuality. Definition. I put out a survey about the omegaverse which ended up having around 500 responses. Perhaps unsurprisingly for a concept that developed organically on the internet, there wasn't a universal definition of omegaverse described by these survey participants, or an agreement of what was necessary to count as such a story. But it's generally understood that omegaverse is a fictional trope which represents a world where humans are divided into three secondary genders, alpha, beta, and omega, on top of the idea of male and female. So you can have a male omega or a female alpha and vice versa, for example. Alpha, beta, and omega each have their own characteristics, both from a physiological standpoint and a social one. In omegaverse stories, these tend to be much more important than male and female. I also just want to note that while I was writing this, I was kind of flicking between using sex and gender to describe what alpha, beta, and omega are within these stories. It's tricky because they are very linked to like the physical body, to hormones, to pheromones, to sex organs, things like that. But they also have a huge social component and are almost always referred to as secondary genders within these stories. So if I'm switching between sex and gender, just know that that's the reason, because it's complicated and different words are used in different fics, like within this fictional universe, and it doesn't really map onto our exact ideas of sex and gender, like how we use them in our world. So I thought I just would say that as a point of reference for if you're noticing that as I'm talking through the video. The specifics of these characteristics, the way that society treats each of them, and other elements of the trope can differ from story to story, but I'm going to go through some popular iterations here. Alphas. So often seen as the physically stronger or more aggressive gender, they are top of the social hierarchy. They're able to get omegas pregnant, and this is true no matter what their gender would be in our world. Like, all alphas tend to have some kind of penis for this reason. Alphas also commonly go into a rut similar to the sex drive of animals in our world, often said to be triggered by omega pheromones. When this happens, the degree to which they have control over their mind and body is dependent on the story's world building. A very common trope in either case is an uncontrolled knot, similar to that produced by some other mammals like dogs and wolves, which is a swelling of the penis upon ejaculation, which effectively locks them and the person they're having sex with together for a short time. So within the natural world of our universe, this is obviously kind of an evolutionary principle to increase the likelihood of reproduction. And so that is kind of the background biological basis within the omegaverse. But within the storytelling potential, it allows for like intimate moments, for awkward moments, for just the kind of things that would arise naturally when two people essentially are forced to spend very intimate time together. Betas. Some stories actually forgo betas altogether, but others have them as a majority of the population. Typically, they are what we would consider to be like normal human beings, nothing different about their bodies or their hormones. There will sometimes be a plot point of an omega or alpha character assuming that they're betas until they present as their true secondary gender in puberty. But yeah, a lot of the time they're regular people. Omegas. Often seen as a physically weaker gender, they are bottom of the hierarchy in terms of social power, although might be seen as special or needing protection in a kind of controlling way. They're able to get pregnant regardless of whether they are male or female as we would understand it. They often go into heat, similar to other mammals in our world, but why and how often will differ from story to story. When this happens, common tropes include nesting or making a safe and comfortable space with like cushions and blankets to spend their time, uncontrolled arousal, often to the point of delirium, slick, which is essentially similar to natural lubrication of human vaginas. Slick is a common term for like natural lubrication in omegas, either from their vagina or anus. Physical pain, anything from headaches to stomach cramps or fever. The unpleasant side effects of a he can be alleviated with sex, but as you may have gathered from the mentions of words like delirium and uncontrollable, this also comes with implications of dubious or complex consent. The fact that these genders have their own social expectations and roles attached also give way to gender-based discrimination of varying levels in most omegaverse fics. Discussions of things like consent and discrimination aren't necessarily always part of the forefront plot of these stories, but fics that do engage with and critique these complexities directly are a pillar of the genre. Other elements that might be include claiming bites. So sometimes the equivalent of like a marriage vow, sometimes just a sex thing. It's pretty much what it sounds like. One or both of the alpha and omega will bite each other. Not an unsurprising addition considering things like the wolf pack language of the genre and also the prevalence of eroticism in like vampire bite imagery in literature, for example. Soulmates or true mates. So adding an extra layer of predestined complexity to some stories is the concept of mates, the one, the person meant for you, confirmed by things like birthmarks or an immediate change when you meet for the first time, like suddenly being able to see in colour, or even like having pheromones that smell particularly attractive, something which is different from the other pheromones that you've smelt in your life. Stories that involve this might explore a typical romance of two people destined for each other, or might seek to subvert this idea of fate and have the characters rebel against it. There are also variations in which you can be soulmates with more than one person, or where soulmates can be purely platonic. Arranged marriage or arranged mating. Whether due to cultural norms in world building, political alliances, or dystopian government legislation, this variation on the trope involves pairing up alphas and omegas through external forces, presenting, closeting, and coming out. In some omegaverse stories, your ABO gender is known from birth, but in most, it tends to manifest itself during puberty. Dependent on the world building, this might be something that they are able to hide, especially in plots that focus on gender discrimination, or where being closeted about the designation would enable a character to fulfill their goals. If Sherlock Holmes has been reimagined as an omega, for example, he may choose to hide his omega status while doing his detective work so that people continue to respect him. Other characters, might be athletes, celebrities, doctors. It's not their biology that prevents them from achieving, but the social expectations and attitudes to them being an omega, and so they might choose to hide. Suppressants or covering your scent. Sometimes in order to stay in the closet, biomedical technology or medicines are necessary. Often known as suppressants or blockers, they will mask pheromones and scents, prevent heats or ruts, and generally let alpha or omega characters live life as betas. Fanfiction preface. If you came to this video with no idea what omegaverse was about, what I just went through is probably a lot. And if you had some familiarity, especially if it was from videos on YouTube that are interested in like exposing weird shit on the internet, you most likely knew some of this and definitely associate it with badly written fanfiction, which you live in fear Jimmy Fallon or James Corden will force actors to read in a bit on a late night show. But I don't think a bunch of this writing being bad is a consequence of it being omegaverse. I don't even think it's a consequence of it being fanfic. I think it's just the inevitable conclusion of it being a creative pursuit that is published on the internet. It's just that with most of these pursuits, what we're used to seeing, music on Spotify, books on Audible, videos on YouTube even, there is an algorithm there, and sometimes industry restrictions which filter out the bad stuff in terms of writing, production quality, and editing. With fanfiction, on the other hand, you're given a default newest first view on the most popular website Archive of Our Own, or AO3, unless you know how to find the gold, you're instead sifting through a bunch of writing by people who are doing this for fun, with no obligation to make it worthy of widespread publication. If YouTube worked like that, you'd think all online video was terrible too, to be honest. But when you're in the community, you'll know how to search for the good stuff. You'll be served recommendation lists on TikTok or roundups on Tumblr. But you have to have gotten to the point of finding the fanfiction gems that keep you coming back and start to learn how to find more. Fanfiction at its best is ultimately very similar to the work that writers do on TV shows or with existing IPs professionally every day. You get brought on to write an episode of Doctor Who, for example. Amazing. That's essentially writing fanfiction, just legitimized and edited and commissioned and paid. Anyone who's read the good stuff of fanfiction will tell you that a lot of fanfiction writers seem to know the characters better than the professionals anyway. Unconstrained by TV episode lengths or conventions of screenwriting, fanfiction can let writers focus intensely on character-driven stories, introspective musings, domestic tales with little interest in a hero's journey plot. They can dig into backstory and linger over the effects of trauma in a way that many shows, more often than not, seem to overlook. Fanfiction is ultimately not a separate type of writing to me. It inevitably crosses over with so-called legitimate forms from speculative fiction to erotica. I don't think it should be dismissed or belittled as a whole because some people do it badly. I don't judge the whole of the embroidery community's legitimacy because someone posted a failed cross-stitch on Instagram, you know? Even as I say that, I suddenly am questioning whether cross-stitch is under the umbrella of embroidery, but we're just going to go with that metaphor. History. Okay, so the omegaverse as we understand it now came from a post on a kink meme message board in 2010, essentially a place where people can request fics that are then fulfilled by writers looking for ideas for new stories. There were these kind of message boards for basically any genre of fan fiction, but the kink meme ones were pretty much all specifically interested in erotica, or at least romance with heavy sexual elements. The prompt post that started it all was Supernatural RPF, or Real Person Fiction, about the two lead actors, Jensen Ackles and Jared Padalecki, rather than the characters that they played in the show. It read as follows. I'd like to see alpha male Jared and male Jensen. Jensen is a snotty prude. Think Lady from Lady and the Tramp. He may be a male, but he's not just going to let anybody take a go at his sweet little until he meets Jared. Then prudy little Jensen turns for Jared. Bonus points for J2 being OTP, Jensen was a virgin before Jared, and now that they met each other, it's for life. That prompt was then filled by a writer on AO3 with a story called I Ain't No Lady, But You Be the Tramp, and the rest, as they say, is history. The genre spread remarkably fast, with people writing about the genre critically as early as 2013, including Christina Boos's piece Ponfar, mpreg, Bones, and the Rise of the Omegaverse in a book about fanfiction, which looked at the different tropes and ideas that were feeding into inspiring and shaping omegaverse fics at the time. Ponfar, mentioned in the title of the chapter, will be familiar to Star Trek fans. It's a crucial element of the Vulcan heat cycle that was part of Spock's story arc in the original series. Because yes, pillar of classic science fiction, Star Trek engaged in some alternate biology heat cycle sex to survive shit too. During Ponfar, Spock has to essentially mate or die. As his urge to mate grows stronger, he loses his logic and becomes more emotional, more violent, even willing to kill his captain in the heat of, well, the heat of being in heat, essentially. Ponfar is ultimately very similar to the idea of omegaverse fics where alphas go into rut or omegas go into heat, if we're being honest with ourselves here. There were other existing tropes in fanfiction that melded into omegaverse. Fics where anyone can get pregnant, including characters who are cis men, for example, were already in existence under the mpreg tag. The Dark Angel fandom is credited with producing a large number of mating cycle fics, and the Sentinel fandom drove a bunch of AUs across fandoms for other pieces of media that use the concept from the show of a kind of alter biology that you can't deny or control. Some original works also held elements of omegaverse tropes before 2010, including books like the novel With Caution by J.L. Langley or the Alpha and Omega series by Patricia Briggs, both werewolf romance series published around 2007. This kind of paranormal erotica, including the concept of alphas, betas, and omegas, connected to the flawed study that's still often cited as like wolf pack dynamics in the natural world. These weren't, however, omegaverse as we'd understand them today, with the additional tropes and elements that I mentioned already. It might be easy to assume that early fics in this genre would stick to the kink meme roots, giving us a wave of purely erotica-based fanfiction before any kind of subversion of the genre would take place, which added more nuance. However, this process of complicating the premise of the genre seemed to be present from the start. An early omegaverse fic from the Inception fandom called The Revolution Will Not Be Civilized was also based on an erotica prompt. Arthur is an omega male while Ames is an alpha. They might or might not have feelings for each other. Arthur goes into heat unexpectedly, and Ames, after wiping out the competition, him for the entire heat. Bonus points for impregnation and even lactation. Seems pretty cut and dry sexual, right? Understandably then, the author's original response started life as, in their words, cracktastic porn shenanigans. However, over subsequent updates to the story, they shifted focus, explaining with a kind of self-deprecation. At some point, all the economic political articles I've been reading over the summer have filtered in, and I've been reading a lot, as well as some experiences from attending protests. So this is a mismatch of id-based indulgence and political wankery. Basically not unlike a cheesy romance novel written by a cheap socialist Ayn Rand knockoff, with porn. Even that very first fic, I'm No Lady But You Be the Tramp, included discussions of power dynamics and omega rights activism, something totally missing from the initial prompt. I think from the very start, we see two concepts of what makes the omegaverse interesting to people emerge alongside each other, the sexual and the political. The genre now. So where has the genre progressed to at this point? So I looked, when I first started scripting this video AO3, at the alpha, beta, omega dynamics tag and drew up some statistics. There are 130,012 works tagged with alpha, beta, omega dynamics. Of those, 62,871, or 48.3%, were rated explicit. This kind of surprised me. For a fanfiction genre so stereotypically linked to sex, to have less than half include explicit sexual content seemed low to me. The next highest was the mature rating, with 29,063 fics, making up 22.4% of the list. These are stories that might include mature themes like sex and violence, but not with graphic descriptions. Then it's teen and up audiences, with 18,718 fics, or a 14.4% share, essentially fics that are the same rating as teen movies. And finally, 8,842, or 6.8%, being suitable for general audiences, implying basically no sexual references at all. When we look at the most popular tags within these works, some are indicative of the genre itself, like mpreg or mating cycles, but we also have a pretty strong distribution of the angst and fluff tags too. These tags are widely used in fanfic to give a sense of the tone of a fic as well as the content, and often the two will be used together to indicate a story that has angsty or heavy elements with characters going through difficult situations, but also supportive partners, friends, or family helping them, being sweet, generally, as the name suggests, fluffy counterparts to any tough topics. I think from this we can see both the erotic origins of the genre, but also the ways that current writers and readers are finding stories to tell in these universes, which are not necessarily entirely sexual. Platonic soulmates, family or pack dynamics, romance-focused arcs, all have a place in current omegaverse works. There has also been a recent rise in omegaverse knowledge and content outside of fanfiction in other online circles. On TikTok, for example, there's an account where Starbucks employees have jokingly tried to make the perfect slick recipe using ingredients at their job, or other users who answer questions about the genre as if they are factual biology classes and comedy skits. And of course, we have the spread of the omegaverse as a concept outside of fanfiction in other writing, notoriously culminating in the omegaverse litigation, which Lindsay Ellis, no relation, has made a few videos about. Essentially, an erotica romance writer issued DMCA takedown notices to other authors for using plot elements in their work that she claimed were plagiarism, but many people would just consider to be staples of the omegaverse genre. It is, as they say, a whole thing. You can definitely read up on it if you're interested, but I would say one of the main consequences that has come from the DMCA takedowns and Ellis's subsequent coverage is omegaverse content being shown sort of out of a lot of its original context, making its way into mainstream spaces in videos and explainer articles. What I'm talking about in this video is kind of the omegaverse through a Western lens, but it's worth noting here that Korean webcomics are a huge source of new omegaverse content, and non-Western fandoms are also some of the most prolific in terms of omegaverse fanfiction. Because my focus in this video is on the way the omegaverse interacts with Western ideas of gender, sexuality, and fandom, I won't be focusing on these, but they are a key part of the wider ideas of omegaverse today, so I wanted to mention them here. So I think at this point in the video, we've all realised that this is almost certainly going to be demonetized, so thank you to Dipsy for hearing this topic and being like, sure, we'll sponsor that. When they first reached out, I was like, an app full of short and sexy audio stories for and by women? Sounds cute, but I am very asexual. But then I mentioned it to a few friends and they were like, are you kidding? I love Dipsy, you have to do it. And then Dipsy was like, we thought your audience might be into the queer stories and the trans and non-binary inclusive audios. And I was like, do it for the subscribers, Rowan. If they're watching this video of all videos, then the least you can do is hook them up with a free trial. So if this has piqued your interest, here's the concept. Immersive soundscapes and characters bringing to life stories from across the romance and erotica spectrum, from workplace passions to holiday flings, all done by professional narrators. Whatever and whoever you're into, they release new content every week, so there is always new potential favourites to discover. There's also really cute audios like guided questions to answer with your partner about love and intimacy, or informational audios delivered by professional sex educators on aspects of relationships and health. And literally while writing this script, I was listening to some of their relaxing non-sexy audios, including natural soundscapes and massage techniques that you can use on yourself, like face massages to de-stress. So whether you want to spice things up with a partner or just listen to an autumn thunderstorm like I will be as I fall asleep tonight, Dipsy can help. Dipsy is offering my subscribers an extended 30-day free trial when you go to dipsystories.com/Rowan Ellis. That's 30 days of full access for free when you go to DIPSEA stories.com/Rowan Ellis. Why is it appealing? I asked in the survey I put out for examples of classic, popular, or important fics in the omegaverse genre, or just fics that they personally would recommend. And some respondents also added their reasoning. Of those that included their justifications, two elements appeared over and over: world building and subversions. World building was particularly notable in fics that explored the implication of a world with ABO gender dynamics. What would that change about the way people go about their lives? How is that different from other omegaverse fics you might read? How would these particular characters with their own canon backstories fit in? For example, if omegas are seen as weak or fragile, would Captain America have been allowed in the army if he was also an omega? What would it change about his character as we know it if he hadn't? What would it say about his character if he managed to gain a place there anyway? How might other elements of marginalization factor into these worlds? What does class do to these dynamics, or religion? These elements were not something that got in the way of someone's enjoyment of something that they saw as merely a piece of erotica. It was in fact integral to their enjoyment of it, whether the story was explicit or not. Some responses also included world building that allowed for representation of effectively intersex characters who straddled multiple ABO designations. There was also a strong interest in fics where characters rejected the biological determinism elements of the secondary genders. Every fic that was recommended with an explanation specified that the reason that they included it was that it engaged in some kind of subversion. These came in various forms, including gender subversion. This plays out on an individual level. A romantic lead turns out to be an extra special alpha who isn't a dick like the rest of them, or an extra special omega who isn't like the other girls. In the 2018 essay, whose title I cannot repeat on YouTube, Critic Melina Popova commented, "This can be read as a strategy of exception finding, where individuals do not seek to change social sexual scripts, but do work to establish exceptions to them in their own relationships, or find partners whom they view as exceptional and non-conforming to the gendered script." It suggests that gender and sex in this universe can be fought, but on an individual level, which in itself emphasizes the unique importance of that relationship that's central to the story. Relationship subversion. Specifically a subversion of the alpha-omega setup with omega-omega or alpha-alpha relationships, essentially creating a version of queerness in the world of the omegaverse. These are often seen in the worlds of omegaverse fics as unnatural relationships, with world building that mirrors the homophobic views of relationships between two men or two women in our world. Social subversion. This type of subversion is often tied to stories with plots that revolve around revolution or activism, revealing that the concept of the omegaverse as inescapable truth is in fact a lie, or that the population is being manipulated or controlled in some way. In one popular Yuri on Ice fic, we see this exchange between a newly presented teenage Omega and an adult Omega who has kept their designation a secret. "You're a doctor?" Yuri asks, astonished. "Out of practice for 8 years, but yes," she says. "Omegas can be doctors?" Yuri asks before he can stop himself. She smiles patiently. "Omegas are perfectly capable of anything an alpha is. The only limitations are those that society decides for them." We can see in this exchange how closely it can map onto ideas of gender and sex in our own world. It could almost be an exchange between two women in a historic novel. I would argue that what is seen as subversion of the world-building premise of the omegaverse is in fact an intrinsic part of the genre itself. Stories that challenge the social hierarchy and gendered assumptions of the omegaverse are a significant subgenre of the genre itself, and elements often creep into the background world-building of even the most straightforward sex-only erotica. Subversion of the premise is itself a part of the premise. It's just sexy. I think it's obvious that I think it's sexy is also a valid reason why people read this genre. Some responses to my survey that mention this element of their enjoyment included, "Honestly, I like the shameless smut and the BDSM tones. I don't usually read ABO, but I don't mind it when I'm searching for porn. A lot of the tropes of ABO are well suited to pretty hardcore porn. It's usually the only way to get the source of BDSM stories where partners actually seem to love and respect each other. As an aspec person, I'm really fascinated by the parts of sex and attraction that are somewhat outside of people's control. The idea of sex as an annoying chore that has to be dealt with, or as a platonic or non-romantic way of supporting people. It clicks in my brain in a specific interesting way when it's done well." This genre brings together a bunch of existing kinks and interests into one clump, so if you're into that kind of thing, you know that this genre is going to be pretty reliably your thing. But I think we can dig deeper into the whys of this appeal. We can position the omegaverse within the wider history of erotica, particularly the kind targeted at people who aren't straight men. Before there were betas, there were bodice rippers or harlequin novels. You may not have read one, but you have almost certainly seen one of the covers. The specific appeal is not the same for everyone, but ideas from literary and social criticism of these kinds of stories can give us some possible options. Firstly, a heavy reliance on tropes can allow readers to feel safe while exploring darker themes. It gives the thrill of a real-life fear without the actual danger. Think of it like riding a roller coaster. You're experiencing essentially what it's like to be thrown from a great height, hurtled through the air, flipped in ways that should kill you in the real world, but in a safe environment. In real life, the man who is overcome with lust and even violence can be legitimately terrifying, but in the context of a fictional work, particularly one with something like the omegaverse that's deliberately removed from our world, it's distant enough to be a safe kind of danger. One of the notable elements of fan fiction is its use of tagging. On AO3, you can use existing or new tags to tell readers exactly what is going to happen in the story before they start reading, whether those are content warnings like sexual assault or gory violence, or just vibes like X character is a disaster lesbian, or slow burn romance, they don't even kiss until chapter 60. You go into an omegaverse fic expecting certain tropes through the genre conventions and the tags. You know what to expect, and there's safety and comfort in that for a lot of people. In the book Loving with a Vengeance, Mass-Produced Fantasies for Women, author Tanya Modleski expands on the appeal of this type of writing. Since the reader knows the formula, she is superior in wisdom to the heroine and thus detached from her. The reader then achieves a very close emotional identification with the heroine, partly because she is intellectually distanced from her and does not have to suffer the heroine's confusion. This balance between being just distant enough from a main character that you're reading about to feel safe, but still close enough to imagine yourself in the romantic or erotically appealing circumstances they find themselves in, is a key part of these type of stories' appeal. There are also fics that engage directly with rewriting this danger in a knowing way. One respondent on my survey commenting, "I like seeing the consent talk, especially in a setting where urges are normalized and the couple is also fighting against stereotypes set by society." Omegaverse stories can give the space for characters to play out conversations that we might want to have and communication we might desire in our own world and relationships around things like consent. One underlying fantasy of a lot of erotica and porn targeted towards women is recontextualizing male-coded violence and power in a way that's pleasurable for female-coded characters. It takes a real power dynamic and eroticizes it, so that the female-coded characters have a certain power, even if that power is just being irresistible. In the book Reading the Romance, author Janice Radway argues that romance novels allow their readers to imagine a world in which their emotional needs could be met by a hero who would still prove to be spectacularly masculine, promising heterosexual women that emotional fulfillment is possible even under patriarchy. In these traditional romance novels, there isn't necessarily the capability of the main characters to escape the gendered world we live in, and so they find a way to cope within it. The prevalence of women and non-binary writers in the fanfiction space, especially when so many of the most popular pairings of characters are two men, is something that's been speculated on at great length. The outsider assumption that fanfiction is all written by straight women who are simply fetishizing men that they find attractive, it's not an entirely accurate picture of fanfiction as a whole as we know it today. Instead, critics like Popova suggest, in an inherently sexist cultural context, women find it difficult to write heterosexual romantic relationships as equal and unencumbered by dominant cultural discourses and power differentials. Writing about male characters, who are, after all, the overwhelmingly main characters in mainstream media, allows for distance from the sexist reality. The argument of pure sexualization ultimately falls apart when you start to look at the overwhelming numbers of queer writers, including lesbians and aro-ace individuals, who write about the romantic lives of these male characters. One study found that writers and readers of queer stories were aware and sometimes wary of the possibility of fetishization. But popular stories within the community feature scenes of domesticity and a greater focus on intimacy and emotion. Obviously, there are fanfiction stories that feature two men in a romantic or sexual relationship, which are just sex. They're just erotica, they are just plain kinky, but that isn't the whole of fanfiction by any stretch of the imagination. And so assuming that that is the primary goal or interest of writers and readers leaves out a lot of nuance. Obviously, fantasy, especially romantic or sexual fantasy, doesn't mean we actually want those experiences in reality. I mean, people watch adventure movies all the time and dream of being like a daring pirate or a gallant knight, but we know that the actual reality of that would majorly suck, like it's dirty and painful and not in a fun way. But lots of people use fandom and stories to fantasize about suffering in a way. Remember what I said earlier about angst and hurt comfort being very popular tags, for example? Within the Omegaverse, characters, especially Omega characters, suffer personally and politically. Engaging with this suffering can reflect a need to explore an anxiety or find catharsis for real-world suffering. Psychologists and sociologists alike have long studied the concept of rape fantasies in women, where they fantasize about being forced to have sex. It's something that they don't want to experience in reality, and yet it's something that gives them enjoyment to imagine within the relative safety of their own minds, where they have control. Theories on the appeal of this include blame avoidance theory. In a society where women are shamed for sexual desires, in the fantasy, this will allow for them to be absolved of any social wrongdoing. Desirability theory. Some women might have this fantasy as an exaggerated manifestation of the want to feel desirable themselves, that men might lose all sense of decency and control around them. Or sympathetic action theory. From a physiological standpoint, a feeling of fear can activate the sympathetic arousal response, which in turn can enhance sexual arousal. These might also be combined or feed into other complex emotions. Modleski, for example, theorizes, A great deal of our satisfaction in reading these novels comes, I'm convinced, from the elements of a revenge fantasy, from our conviction that the woman is bringing the man to his knees, and that all the while he is being so hateful, he is internally grovelling. In this way, we can see how, much like how a rape fantasy might absolve someone of sexual guilt, the omegaverse might also absolve someone of gender guilt alongside that. If you believe in gender equality, you might feel conflicted about desiring a gendered power dynamic in your relationship, either sexually or romantically, and the potential for strict, overwhelming biological urges in the omegaverse can support that fantasy. And other types of omegaverse fiction give us the exact opposite potential. As Popova explains, examining ABO stories in detail reveals that readers and writers who enjoy and embrace the genre are highly conscious of the consent issues involved and actively use the generic conventions of the omegaverse to explore them. While stories often at least partially follow a romance formula, such in-depth exploration of issues of inequality and consent is not a feature usually found in either pornography or romance. Ultimately, I'm not sure if you can strictly separate the kinky, sexy appeal of the genre and the more political, social, or intellectual appeals. They are sometimes separate, but also sometimes the subversions or engagement with ideas of gender and consent are part of what makes them sexy to people in the first place. Gender deconstruction. The very premise of the omegaverse has the potential to deconstruct our own ideas of gender, to put a mirror to its importance, but also its absurdity in many ways. Marianne Gunderson puts it well in her essay, Rewriting Sex and Gender in Omegaverse Fanfiction, asking, what if the basic structure of human reproductive functions positioned one sex as fundamentally dependent and vulnerable to exploitation? What if this group was valued only for their reproductive abilities and was restricted in their participation in society because of this? What if people of one gender were treated as the property of another because of their reproductive abilities? What if their inability to consent to sexual relations was seen as irrelevant? Arguably, many of these questions could be answered with a direct reference to the current or historical situation of women, with or without some exaggeration. In this way, omegaverse fiction allows us to examine our own ideas of sex and gender with a level of distance while still engaging with questions of power, exploitation, and interpersonal relationships. Gunderson continues, rather than representing women or femaleness, the omega figure is an embodiment of multiple discourses by which women have been and still are constructed as other. The omega does not signify woman, he or she signifies the otherness with which the category woman has been imbued. These discourses include the relationship between gender and bodily autonomy. The vulnerability of an omega in heat is often compounded by the lack of social support for them in the omegaverse world. There are dystopian versions of omegaverse societies which show clear parallels to our own world in the way that they criminalize omega bodies, banning abortions, outlawing suppressants, and otherwise acting as paternalistic protectors of the weak-minded omega population. This idea of displaying gender discourse within speculative writing is a cornerstone of feminist fiction within mainstream publication. We can see the work of writers like Margaret Atwood, Naomi Alderman, Octavia Butler as obvious inspiration for some omegaverse writings. The focus on structural oppression, gendered experiences, power dynamics also play out in many omegaverse stories, from the critical dystopias to the hopeful utopias. The somewhat artificial separation of fan fiction and real fiction is especially thin with the genres of science fiction and fantasy, where a not insignificant number of traditionally published authors seem to have got their start in fan fiction or go on to write for existing IPs, essentially writing official fan fiction as their job. Like novelist Naomi Novak quite literally is one of the founders of AO3 itself. The slight distance of sci-fi or fantasy stories from our own world has always given the opportunity to examine those differences, to question the assumptions of our own societies, to turn over the beliefs that underpin so much of our world. What if, they often ask, this given notion was no longer a certainty? What does this say about us, as well as what it says about this fictional world? Utopian commentary. Some omegaverse fanfiction delves not into speculative dystopia, but a kind of utopian society. The puzzle pieces of the genre's tropes can be slotted together and extrapolated on in so many ways, including imagining what a better social model of gender and sex looks like. As Gunderson puts it, creates a space to imagine their unravelling and envisioning the possibility for change. One respondent to my survey talked about the possibilities they saw in omegaverse fanfiction. I enjoy the idea that people get 2 or 3 days off work each month for their heat. That seems almost utopian. This is a potentially obvious accommodation for us if we're conceiving of an omegaverse society from the ground up, giving omegas time off to deal with a regularly painful and difficult time created by their body's reproductive cycles. So why has menstrual leave not been something implemented or accepted beyond certain individual companies in our world? Why do some countries not give paid parental leave as a given? We can see it in the world building of some omegaverse fics, a more compassionate setup for these kind of experiences that prioritize the person over business and profit. Sometimes the utopia comes from the idea that current dystopian elements reflected in our own world can be overthrown and replaced by setting up an unjust world in the omegaverse but having the characters successfully fight against it. Another survey respondent explaining, they usually have more hopeful tones about the end of the patriarchy, and I feel like it's less emotionally taxing to consume because it's a fake outrageous world. I think the soulmate aspect of some omegaverse fics also gives a kind of utopian idea of romance, especially for many young queer people who feel a sense of loneliness and hopelessness in regards to finding love. It's something I talked about in a previous video in regards to the reactions to the Heartstopper TV series. What we saw there was a lot of queer people grappling with the trauma of feeling alone, undesirable, cut off from the happily ever after idea that straight counterparts had been promised. The idea of soulmates can be a kind of comfort read in a way that gives a romantic certainty and inevitability of finding the one for you, and to have it be a natural thing within the world building, even if you are queer. What can this show about our own world? The fact that people are writing and enjoying this genre for all of these reasons and more can tell us not just about individual preferences, but wider social ideas. The omegaverse is connected intrinsically to our own world, and specifically to our own concepts of sex, gender, and sexuality. We might view the traits of an alpha or omega in this universe as absurd or cringeworthy, but this is ultimately through the lens of our own experiences with male and female, man and woman. An alien outside of our view of these concepts would find it equally bizarre. Like, you can just imagine them being like, wait, so some of you have a thing that goes out and some of you have a thing that goes in? You got sort of two kinds, but sometimes it mixes around? You don't have 17 kinds? Or like, you're not all the same? Or, okay, and then for some reason, the ones that have the thing that's on the outside, you made them wear trousers, and then you didn't, it was like not okay for the other ones to wear trousers for what? Very confusing, very weird, very random, okay? The omegaverse, after all, is just another setup of the same social hierarchy, unequal power dynamics, and biased medical structures that exist in our world. It would honestly be weird to me if anyone saw this setup and didn't think about how it could be used to engage with these concepts as a writer or a reader, especially within fan fiction, which is so often preoccupied with correcting a dissatisfaction with the text or concept it is engaging with, whether through fix-it fics that slightly rewrite canon or entirely alternate universe setups that layer queerness onto a predominantly straight and cis original. Being dissatisfied with wider ideas of gender and sexuality doesn't come as a surprise, especially knowing how many fanfiction writers and readers identify as queer themselves. It's healthy, I think, to take a step back from supposed norms and examine why we see them that way. Looking at the idea that the birthing gender of Omega in ABO fics is also seen as the weaker gender needing to be protected can shine a light on the stereotypical idea of cis womanhood in our world. I mean, if a bunch of people are able to carry sometimes multiple kids inside their bodies for months, literally growing an entire new human being and then going through one of the most painful experiences with risks of permanent physical damage and even death, it doesn't seem like weak and delicate from like a objective point of view. It's the social nonsense outside of that which has positioned cis women that way historically and even today. When we see the exaggerated roles in omegaverse fiction, we also see an absurd funhouse mirror placed against our own biases. So what might we see reflected back at us when reading these works? Gender roles and assumptions. There is this overarching idea in Western fiction that the everyman character, the one that all people are meant to sympathize with and relate to, is a straight, white, cisgender, able-bodied man. Even in fantasy or sci-fi works, they are often the centerpiece around which the other is revolving, from Arthur Dent to Bilbo Baggins to any number of other Martin Freeman characters, I guess. This is complicated in the Omegaverse, as Gunderson notes. By writing a male character as an omega, experiences of being treated as other in female-coded ways are imagined to be experienced by a character who represents the male norm. As a result of this double gendering, experiences of female-coded otherness are imported into the universal. Gender discrimination is something that can be projected potentially onto anyone. For many who look at the Omegaverse with awkward scorn, the idea of the omega is so perverse and absurd precisely because of its projection onto our existing concept of maleness. How could anyone imagine this man character like that? Isn't that degrading, humiliating, gross even? That he should be reduced to a second-class gender? Not just because it's conceived of as a second-class gender in this fictional world, but because it comes way too close to being like a woman in our world. And it's not just individual experiences of gender and sex, but the way that these play out in intimate sexual and romantic settings. The way that unequal power dynamics are inevitable when you enshrine arbitrary social assumptions onto bodies based on nothing but reproductive roles. What does consent really look like in this kind of setup when viewed from a slightly removed point of view? How do wider social inequalities affect the equity within interpersonal relationships? These are the kind of questions which have been discussed in our world for decades. Assumptions about who should stay home with the kids, who should support the family, who is a slut for sleeping around and who is a player, who is being a tease, who is asking for it, who should feel lucky or like a real man rather than a victim or survivor if they go through statutory rape. The way that women being viewed as possessions is so insidiously ingrained in our history that it's most dangerous for those in abusive relationships after they decide to leave. We see this in that very first omegaverse fic, I Ain't No Lady But You Be the Tramp, written for all intents and purposes as a piece of pure erotica to fill a prompt on a kink-specific site. There is no real reason for the story to dive into any critical engagement with gender equality in the premise, but the work includes this exchange. Tonight, he'd been telling Jensen all about living in Seattle and how he was thinking of moving back to San Francisco to help a friend head the equal rights movement. Jensen's heart was pounding. He'd never heard of that kind of stuff spoken about so openly before. Even though everyone in town knew how he felt about being what he was, they just thought he was a snob or a prude. No one knew what he really believed. And here was this guy, this alpha no less, talking like it wasn't radical, like it was simply common sense. Why do you even care? Jensen kept his eyes fixed on the mop. Too nervous or excited or something to risk looking up? None of that's your problem. Jared reached out and snagged his elbow, startling him. For once, the man wasn't sprawled back, but perched on the edge of his booth, eyes intense. It's everybody's problem. As noted by Popover, omegaverse fanfiction can offer ways of negotiating meaningful, consensual, intimate relationships within wider abusive social structures, in a way that isn't mutually exclusive with elements of erotica or romance. In this example, the fact that Jared, the alpha character, is interested in gender equality and is so casual about his support is a huge part of his appeal as a romantic and sexual partner. The idea of enjoying sex that plays with a power dynamic is explicitly separated from the idea of enjoying the power dynamic outside of that specific sexual setting. Jensen in this story is clearly sheltered, inexperienced and unsure, but we see in no uncertain terms that Jared doesn't even have the passing thought to take advantage of that. The fact that he's actively involved in Omega rights is as much part of his appeal as his looks, even in a story that is written to satisfy an erotic, specific prompt. Biological determinism. So biological determinism is the idea that most human characteristics, physical and mental, are determined at conception by hereditary factors passed from parent to offspring. When mapped onto sex and gender, it is the idea that our differing social positions and expectations are essentially down to our biology. This is, of course, nonsense. The denial of social factors in labels of sex and gender is immediately debunked by the differences in these attitudes across times and cultures. But it's the same logic we see in like podcast bros viral TikTok clips where they say things like, women are all emotionally driven because of their wombs. They can't handle leadership, bro. Social attitudes might unite women in a struggle for gender equality, but that doesn't mean that there is some universal biological mandate that defines all women's thoughts and behaviors. We can see this same concept reflected in omegaverse fiction in the attitude that the capacity to give birth automatically means that you must be sweet and nurturing. This attitude is often subverted in these stories, as we've seen already, but also by the very fact that they don't equate ability to give birth with woman, these stories throw up the absurdity of linking biological capacity with any kind of social role or in like a universal scale in our world. Omegaverse stories that emphasize the fictional society is wrongly convinced of biological determinism gives a sense of hope that these structures and attitudes can be changed. Even in these worlds where characters are forced by their bodies to go wild with lust or feel compelled to be with only their soulmates, there are those that are able to resist these instincts, that show that even in a world with the most exaggerated versions of natural desires, biology doesn't have to define you. experiences of womanhood. Although biology may not be the same as destiny, there are experiences in our world that are mapped onto counterparts in the omegaverse. Things like periods and pregnancy affecting those with uteruses, but also the social experience of being perceived as a woman. Gunderson talks in her essay about how omegaverse stories sometimes describe the first heat as a crisis, a bodily betrayal that initiates the transition into becoming a gendered body, a body which is constituted as other and is subject to restrictive gender norms. Connecting this to the idea of a first period, I think you could probably compare literary descriptions of a first period with fan fiction depictions of a first heat and find a lot of similarities in the way they describe the lack of control, unfamiliar fluids, and even potential pain involved. Both of these experiences are connected to your body. They're part of you, but also something that is happening to you that you can't control. They mark you as part of a social and political other that is not a cis man. Some omegaverse fics include social ideas of shame or embarrassment around heats, again a clear parallel to our own concepts of menstruation. Queerness. Another appeal of the genre is the inherent queerness that can be found within. The natural and moral ideas of gender and sexuality in our own world are collapsed in on themselves. One responder to my survey wrote, "As a non-binary bisexual person, I think ABO roles can create characters that I relate to on a personal level or make me feel gender euphoric, such as alpha female characters, omega male characters, and beta characters. These fics can be freeing to read as a non-binary person who feels restricted by our world's traditional concepts of sex and gender." And even within a potentially queer genre, people find new ways to queer it further. Picking up that genre subversion baton in examples like a supernatural fic written in 2011 called Show Me How You Do That Trick, where people can shift between designations of alpha, beta, and omega. The setting of the story is a school where students are taught how to control this shift, ultimately maintaining the neutral beta designation as their normal form. Within this world, however, characters clearly identify with designations outside of this neutral one, feeling more strongly connected to alpha or omega, or even with the very experience of shifting fluidly between them itself. It explores ideas of gender confusion, fluidity, identity, and more, using the speculative omegaverse setup as its backdrop. Another survey respondent wrote, "I like the trans inclusivity of it, the world building you can do in your own fics in terms of constructing a social hierarchy and gender dynamics and rules. And these don't have to be the same in every ABO fic. I like reading ABO where the stories are coded metaphors for how marginalised people are treated in our world." An omegaverse story can separate ideas that are tied up with sex and gender in our world from the supposedly corresponding identity. Where in our world, trans people might experience their identities challenged or their rights denied, in the world of the omegaverse, you can have a man who's pregnant or a woman with a penis, and they're accepted as a man and a woman respectively without any question. Omegas are not a literal matchup for cis women, trans men, or any other identity in our world, but the level of similarity of circumstance and experience allows multiple groups to see elements of themselves and their stories while maintaining some emotional distance from their own trauma. Criticisms of the genre. The omegaverse is strongly rooted in heterosexism, cis-sexism, and the patriarchy. Cis male characters are essentially cast into cis women's prescribed roles, but don't fight against oppression, stereotypes, assumptions. Don't get me started on the lack of birth control and abortion in those fics. I usually just find them deeply offensive. Like, why don't you fight? Where is the feminism, the activism, the breaking of binaries? That was a quote from one of the responders to my survey. I think we've seen through this video so far that the omegaverse is a hugely varied genre of fiction. As such, most criticism is ultimately going to be about a subsection of the genre rather than the whole thing. The idea here that the omegaverse is devoid of activism or breaking of binaries ignores omegaverse fiction, which does exactly those things as its main focus. But just because criticisms aren't encompassing of the entire genre doesn't mean that they are entirely without merit. I think it's useful to look at what people have found troubling, objectionable, or just worthy of critical consideration, because if we're looking at the potential of the genre to do interesting things, we can also look at the potential for it to do harm. Racism. This to me is probably the most compelling criticism of omegaverse in its current form. Racism is, of course, a problem within the wider concept of fandom itself. I guess because it's a problem everywhere. Historically, there haven't been many characters of colour in pieces of media that get the mainstream fandom treatment, and when they do exist, they're often ignored or treated badly. The mistreatment of Kelly Marie Tran from the Star Wars cast has been heavily documented, along with the sidelining of Rose and Finn's characters in the movie themselves. Princess Weeks has talked before about how Gwen's character from the BBC show Merlin has historically been treated poorly by Merlin and Arthur shippers in the fandom. And even when characters of colour are in lead roles in the original text, fandom will often ignore them in favour of pairing together white side characters, like the sidelining of Scott McCall in the Teen Wolf fandom, for example. In this way, we can see how fanfiction can celebrate queerness, but at the potential cost of vilifying or ignoring the characters of colour. That idea of the everyman being male, cis, straight, white from earlier, well, the fandom everyman, the one that fanfic and shipping automatically seems to rally around, is often essentially just one step removed from that. He's still a cis white man, he's just gay. Angie Fazekas, in her essay Alpha, Beta, Omega, Racialized Narratives in Fandom's Investment in Whiteness, has pointed out that some fanfiction tropes, including omegaverse fics, are in danger of including racialized references transposed onto these white characters. In some iterations of the omegaverse, for example, there is a conceptualization of these extreme power dynamics between alphas and omegas as a kind of slavery. She describes how these fandom spaces overwhelmingly become a place for white fans to write white narratives about white characters, a place to feign discussing race without ever actually discussing race. In focusing on gender and sexuality without considering other intersections of identity, there is a risk of essentially focusing only on white gender and white sexuality, extrapolating imagined worlds and dynamics which are limited to that worldview. When focused on a white experience of gender, the history of women perceived as men's property in the West might be logically exaggerated into a kind of slavery narrative. But this ignores the experiences of women for whom that was not an exaggeration. When fiction slips into the slavery equivalent, Fazekas argues, it's more complicated than that of a lot of other power differential fan fiction, because it is based upon a narrative that appropriates the historical experiences and intergenerational trauma of black people to further a romantic or sexual narrative between white alpha, beta, omega. Unlike other power exchange scenarios, the position of slave and the intergenerational trauma that follows it cannot be experienced by white authors and readers. She doesn't close off the possibilities of the genre and what it might have the capability to explore, but emphasizes the limits when preoccupied with white and male characters. While the omegaverse opens up possibilities of playing with gender and sexuality in new and interesting ways, the stories overwhelmingly focus on pairings between two white men, effectively foreclosing their progressive potential and recentering whiteness. Whiteness is oppressor and oppressed, master and slave, and thus not explicitly tied to either. White subjects are therefore not complicit in slavery, and slave narratives can safely be consumed as sites of pleasure without any attendant guilt or acknowledgement of responsibility on behalf of white readers. Transphobia. Although, as we've seen, the very appeal of the genre to some readers is a perceived trans inclusivity, other people see the opposite in omegaverse works. Because the genre established new sex and gender norms, some see this as reinforcing the legitimacy of the existing norms in our world. One Tumblr user suggested that to make the omegaverse non-transphobic, they would need to change it to a flexible, non-binary gendered society rather than the rigidly structured biology as destiny ABO society that's trans-inclusive either explicitly or implicitly if it's a new social universe with different rules. One respondent to my survey wrote, I think it can get into some gender essentialism, and also the whole trope of mpreg really doesn't take into account that men do in fact get pregnant. I think it's complicated, but ultimately a lot of omegaverse work can fall into transphobia. This is indicative of the argument that I've seen elsewhere online that it could be considered transrasia as a genre, with authors writing omegaverse instead of writing trans characters, for example writing pregnancy into male omega stories rather than just writing about a pregnant trans man. In an essay on AO3, writer Lamille challenged this reading of the genre, saying, claiming that writing omegaverse is the same thing as writing trans characters is othering and dehumanizing towards trans people, equating them with something that is not possible in the real world, something that is not human. They see omegaverse characters and trans characters based on real experiences of transness in our world as ultimately entirely separate from each other, and not in competition, as it were. Although I've highlighted in this video the potential of the omegaverse with the large number of subversive and complex stories that deliberately rail against the idea of biological determinism, there are also stories that treat the idea of the fictional sex and gender hierarchy as undeniable facts within that world. In the space of that iteration of the omegaverse, alpha and omega characters are indeed determined by their designation alone. The omegaverse worlds themselves, the backdrops of these stories, may well be transphobic, because in many cases they're meant to reflect our own society, which is itself transphobic. but they can also hold a mirror to the things that are wrong with our ideas of sex and gender, the things that are complex, messy, unjust. The stories written against this backdrop are often about criticizing the world that they're set in, breaking down binary ideas of gender and sex, and exposing lies about the supposed biological determinism within. I'm not convinced that just writing about an unjust or unequal world means that the genre is endorsing the inequalities themselves on a universal level. So where does that leave us as we reach the end of this video? I think that the immediate sense of weirdness from the omegaverse genre can make it seem on the surface like just another bizarre internet kink. Even engaging casually with the type of story that floats into the mainstream through like actor reads fan fiction about themselves viral videos or ABO reaction TikToks can paint all work in this genre with the same brush. In a Medium article entitled The Misogynistic Undertones of the Omegaverse, the author argues that Omegaverse fics are just for porn, there is no nuance, and it takes an objectively horrific situation and contorts it for sexual purposes, often never even acknowledging how wrong what's happening is. But I hope that by this point in the video, we can see how reductive this sentiment is when we look at the totality of the genre, the variety of world building, and the appeal that so many writers and readers find in it beyond simple pornography. I'm not gonna lie, I never thought I'd be making a video about the omegaverse, but I'm kind of glad that I did. What started as a joke video concept I thought wouldn't have much substance has ended up as an I don't even know how long essay, which has definitely made me think deeper about a lot of this stuff. I'd love to know what you think in the comments. Has this changed anything about your view of the genre? Let me know. If you want to help support me make these videos, like I said, you can support me on Patreon. We have some very cool tiers there. There's a Discord, it's very nice. Link will be in the description. And thanks again to Dipsy for pulling through as this month's sponsor. Don't forget you can get 30 days full access for free when you go to dipsystories.com/Rowan Ellis.